Welcome back to another episode of Raul's World of Synths. I am Raul. Today we're going to be going a little bit further with the A144 Morph Controller right here in the center. In the previous demonstrations, if you were with us, we kind of went through some of the basic morphing capabilities of this in conjunction with the A135 module, which I have now moved off camera from here. And I've replaced it with a few other modules that we're going to be utilizing in the next series of demos that's going to demonstrate something called Waveshaping. So if you have any questions about the previous ones, just kind of jump back and maybe rewatch those, because I think we went into pretty good detail on those. But for now, we're going to do audio rate into the Morph controller. All the previous demos, we were kind of looking at DC or low frequency signals going into this guy and then using it to morph. But this time we're going to do some audio rate signals, maybe a few triangle waves, sine waves, stuff like that. But I thought it might be important for us to talk about what waveshaping is before we jump right in. I'm not going to do a complete comprehensive discussion on waveshaping. I'm sure it could go on for hours and hours. But I did want to talk briefly about it. So just a general description about what it is, and you can read more about it if you want to online. It's a technique that's going to allow you to process an input and then create an output that is richer in harmonics than the original input. So basically, that's pretty broad, but you'll find if you do a little bit of research out there that waveshapers, for the most part, are a pretty broad category of modules out there. Doepfer does even create some specialized Waveshaper modules, and I think a little bit later we'll actually be using one of those, not in this segment, but maybe down the road in a month or so, maybe a little more. We'll be looking at some specific modules for only waveshaping. But this one is going to be specifically about the Morph controller. And we're going to talk about how you can create that harmonically rich content out of your input. In general, it works best when you use a simple waveform, something like a sine or a triangle, where you'll be able to, notice for the most part that you're getting much more harmonics than you originally started with. It might be a little trickier to be able to detect that on a harmonically rich source already and then do waveshaping to it, but it definitely is a worthwhile effect for sure. So you can see here that we have a new friend for the A144 sitting right next to it, the A138 polarizing mixer, and this is going to come into play a little bit later. So we'll talk about it when we get there. But for now, let's just go ahead and set up the basic patch and kind of get this going. I do have my oscilloscope over there off on the right, waiting in the wings so that we can hear what it is that we're doing. Now, let's see. I'm going to use multiples over here, so let's just get this patch going. I'm going to choose a triangle wave because that's what I used in my little practice over here. And before I just pipe it over there, I'm going to actually take it into the multiples because we're actually going to see sort of before and after here. So I'm going to pipe it into the multiples right there. And then I'm going to take the first multiple and then go over into my Morph controller. So I'm going to take a black cable and then go over into my Morph controller. There we go. And then the second one, the second multiple of that signal, I'm going to actually take over to my oscilloscope in a moment. Not going to do it yet, because I don't want to ruin the surprise, so to speak. So now that we have our audio going in here, I have my CV control over here turned all the way up. Now I'm going to take my outputs from over here, and I'm just going to pipe them, output 1 to input 1 of my polarizing mixer. My polarizing mixer, I don't want to get into too much detail with it, but I will let you know that at the center position, or at 12 o'clock, that's going to be no signal passing to the output. And then over on the clockwise side, that's going to be your standard mixer configuration. So for now, let me just leave it at 12 o'clock, and I'll explain a little bit more in a bit. So here we go, output number 2, over to input 2. There we go, make sure that's all the way in there. And then I'm going to take output 3, over to input 3. There we go. And now we go output 4, over to input 4. Okay, now we're going to be taking the output from our polarizing mixer and going into our oscilloscope so we can kind of see the dry signal. So let me take my output, go straight over to my oscilloscope, and we should get a little bit of action over here. Here we go. There we go. Now, signal for the most part is all the way down, but let me go ahead and bring up my signal. And let me just do a small adjustment on my internal mixer. So now I'm bringing more of each of the individual outputs up over here by moving these over in the clockwise direction. That's my final output right there. So let me just bring them all the way to the max. I don't think the signal should distort. Okay, so there we have our output from the morph controller. It's receiving the input of our triangle wave right over here, going into the morph controller, and then going out. And it's creating this sort of wave shape that you see at the oscilloscope. Now, one thing you might notice, which is different than maybe something you've seen before, because I kind of sort of snapped when I saw this, was you notice that the waveform doesn't actually have a negative portion for the most part. Just to show you what I'm talking about, let me unpatch it, and let me pipe over to the original. So there we go. That's our normal standard waveform that we're used to. It has a positive portion over here. Sorry about that. It has a positive portion over here at our oscilloscope, and it has a negative portion. Now, if I were to zoom out a little bit and look at my waveform, I could see that it is both in the positive region of my oscilloscope and in the negative. But now let me unpatch my original signal, and let me take the output from the morph controller, and you can see that for the most part it's primarily focused on the upper region. It's not really veering down into the negative region. This is actually something called, and I'm not going to get into too much detail because I haven't done a lot of research on it. This is called actually half rectified waveform. Now if I kind of zoom back into my waveform, let me flip back to where I was a moment ago. So right there where the waveform peaks are, you can see that they're not all present. So you have these little gaps. So those gaps kind of represent where the waveform actually should be going. Let me put my finger in here. Should be going down into that lower negative section, but it doesn't. It just kind of gets chopped off right there. And what's actually causing that, curiously enough, going back to some of the previous videos, is that the input over here is actually set to only accept signals in the 0 to 5 range. Now that is going to be very important a little bit later when we take a look at how the polarizing mixer can actually help us with this situation that we got going here. Because if you remember now, I was talking about how in the clockwise direction this gives us a standard mixer configuration. Going in the opposite direction on any of these sort of adjustments here will actually allow me to take the waveform into my negative region, and then on my oscilloscope I'll see a more balanced waveform. It'll have both a positive and a negative portion to it. But that's going to be what's going on a little bit later. But the interesting thing I wanted to show you, since we're looking at some pretty interesting things over here at our oscilloscope, is let me flip into one of my other modes on my oscilloscope. And this one is actually going to let me see the spectrum. So this is the waveform spectrum that you can see at the top right here of the current signal that we have. So let me get another cable so that we can observe what the original sort of harmonic spectrum of our triangle wave was. So here we go. Let me bring this over here. Now you might hear the triangle wave for a moment when I patch this. Whoops. There we go. But let me just bring it down from my output. And so right there, all we're hearing is the wave-shaped output. I just turned down the regular triangle wave. This is not exactly the view I wanted you to see. But let me flip into one of these. So right there, yeah, this is a really good one. Right there you can see in the bottom waveform, that is our normal triangle wave and our normal harmonic spectrum for our triangle wave. And then the top, you can see the wave-shaped output from a simple triangle wave. So I found this pretty interesting. So now at this point, if I wanted to just work with what I have so far and not do any further modifications to my waveform, I could. I could bring down the level of output number 1, and you can see that the harmonic spectrum of my my process signal up here at the top has now changed a little bit. And if I bring down input 2, the harmonic spectrum changes a little bit more on my oscilloscope as well. And then if I adjust number 3, same thing, I get a different shift on my oscilloscope harmonic spectrum, and then output 4. So I'm going to bring them all kind of more to center here. There we go. And let's try a different waveform. So right now we're working with a triangle wave, and then just get a different sound going on here. So I'm just going to unpatch my triangle wave, and now we no longer have anything going into our oscilloscope, as you can see over there. And now let me just patch a sine wave. There we go. So now we have a sine wave going over into our morph controller, right there, and then going out to our mixer. And then we have a simple sine wave going back out to our oscilloscope, visible at the bottom. Now in general, the sine wave should be, for the most part, one frequency, and that's not necessarily representing here. It is showing, kind of different frequencies at the bottom. But there is probably a little bit of bleed that's happening from one of the outputs to the adjacent outputs. And I mean to my oscilloscope, because the jacks themselves are very similar to what we have up here at the top. One jack is next to the other. And in some cases, when you're dealing with analog signals, you'll get a little bit of bleed from one to the other. So that's probably going to account for that. But the basic idea that you're getting here is that as it goes in, you have a very kind of more simple harmonic spectrum like what you got here at the bottom, and then it can turn into something like this. And this can be very useful for you when you are making a sound composition or maybe just a noise composition. I'm just going to make a few adjustments here. And it can allow you to create all kinds of different timbral possibilities. Similar to what you would have on the drawbars, when you adjust this, you're kind of an organ, you're changing the harmonic spectrum when you're using the drawbars. But of course, this is definitely a much different sound than what you would have on a Hammond organ or something like that. But the idea is the same, as you're kind of adjusting the harmonic spectrum of your output. And that's kind of the idea behind the wave shaping. So that's going to actually wrap up the first segment that I wanted to do in this audio demonstration. In the next segment, what we'll be taking a look at is some of the oscilloscope views Right now we're looking at sort of the harmonic spectrum views of this, but I do want to take a look at some of the waveform views so that we can see more in detail how our waveform is being adjusted later on with the polarizing mixer. And then, of course, we'll go into the use of the polarizing mixer, and then we'll see where we go from there. So thank you so much for watching, and keep on patching out there.